Okay, Egypt now, Robert, is the IMF's second biggest debtor after Argentina, and Sisi's economic strategies are reliance on hot money flowing into the domestic debt as a source of foreign currency and the muscular expansion of the army across the economy. So, from your perspective, what are the problems with these strategies?
Well, the problem with depending upon hot money, that is the flows of private capital, is that it can flow two ways. And as we saw in the wake of COVID, about 20 billion flowed out. And then in the wake of the war in the Ukraine, about 23 billion flowed out. Now we have an IMF agreement, admittedly for only 3 billion compared to the 12 billion back in 2016. But each IMF agreement, and this is now the fourth, has been associated with an increase of foreign capital inflow because the certification by the IMF of the Egyptian economy has been used by those who sell Egyptian sovereign debt, most of whom are in London, have been able then to sell on those assets to investors, whether they're in pension funds or individual investors or whatever, on the grounds that Egypt has been certified as a reasonably stable political economy in which the high interest rates paid on sovereign debt are a real value. They're a bargain, and you should get it. This time, however, there is no indication as yet of an inflow of foreign capital of anything like the magnitude back in 2016 or in the two subsequent events, which also stimulated inflows of capital. So now, even the IMF imprimatur is insufficient to cause the vendors of Egyptian sovereign debt to be able to convince purchasers that this debt is not too risky, because now investors are frightened to death of the risk inherent in buying Egyptian sovereign debt. So this illustrates the downside of depending upon private short-term capital investments to sustain your economy. They may flow out and they may never flow back in again. And that's the situation which Egypt is in at the present time. Now, I'm sorry, Osama, I forgot the second part of your question.
Yeah, the second part is if Sisi, the other strategy is the muscular expansion of the army across the economy. And you know, Cairo is committed now to reducing the state footprint in the economy, including military-owned companies, by withdrawing from non-strategic sectors. So the question is, do you believe Sisi will act on his pledges regarding the military-owned companies?
I don't know. I think there are two possible, contending interpretations of what he wants to do. The first is that this is a smokescreen, that he does not intend to implement it, that it provides the paper justification for the IMF loan, and it also then can be seen by potential investors in Egypt as a good sign that the military will no longer have an advantaged position. And so if they invest in a civilian company or establish one themselves, that they will have a level playing field on which to compete. And so the argument here is that he doesn't intend that, that he's just putting this forward for these various reasons, but that over time, the fundamental change that the IMF agreement embodies will not occur. The other explanation, you can say, is more charitable to the leadership, in a certain way at least. And that explanation is that the military is not only a threat to the well-being of the country, it's a threat to the current leadership itself. It has become enormously powerful, politically, economically, socially, in every way. Its tentacles are to be found in the educational system, in the agricultural system, in the manufacturing sector, in the construction business, you name it. There is no area now where the military is not a significant actor. And based upon all of that, combined with the continued importation of arms of a massive amount, you have an interest group that basically is running the country. And so if you're the president and you see this huge institution growing stronger and stronger and stronger, you must begin to ask yourself as to whether or not this institution might someday decide it doesn't need you. And that's precisely what happened to Mubarak. And Sisi was an instrument of that. And so you could argue that now Sisi sees he's better trim the militaries, trim their sails a bit. So he demonstrates to them that he's the boss and they can't just do whatever they want. They've got to take account of him. And he will then deprive some potential opponents within the officer corps of their privileges and so on. So I think there are two explanations, both of which are consistent with the agreements in a formal sense, but neither of which do we have enough evidence about to be able to conclude which is the correct one.
Yeah, and this may raise a very important point, Robert. In your book, Egypt, you explained how important that the state pays is, and there is how millions of Egyptians, mainly civil servants and police officers, army officers, and their families and employees are backing the regime because they are benefit from jobs, from salaries, from subsidies. Now the regime cutting subsidies, Cairo committed to withdraw military from all these sectors you just mentioned. So do you think this could start a relationship crackdown between the Sisi regime and its state base?
You put your finger on a very interesting aspect of this regime, and it is that it's attacking and has been increasing the severity of that attack on the base, which was built by Nasser and sustained by Sadat and Mubarak. Morsi was there for too short a period to do anything about it. But that base was the civil service, the role of the civilian state everywhere, and including the economy. Sisi obviously had come to resent the civilian civil service long before he became president. He had, I think, the idea that it was overstaffed, underperforming, it had too many privileges, it wasn't competent, and it wasn't loyal in the end. And so what he wanted to do was create, from the top down, a new administrative structure that would personally empower him and give him complete control over as much of the political economy as any one man could possibly have. And so the military was part of that, but he has also gone about building training systems for technological cadres to be then integrated into this parallel state structure. He has also recruited private businessmen into it. And so what he's done is created a second state, and one which he controls directly himself. So now his problem is what to do about the first state, which has some 5 million employees and therefore maybe 25 million people depending on it, a quarter of the population. And this is the problem he has right now, because he's deprived them of privileges, he is demeaning them, he is making it perfectly clear he has no confidence in them. And so there's bound to be resentment. And the question is, what then do these people who were employed or dependent upon those who were employed or who believed in the system that created that state, what are they going to do? And they become, in my view, fertile grounds for opposition to the regime. And so the strategy of building a parallel state necessarily also has to have a strategy to repress opposition. There is no other way, because they are not reaching out to these people to give them some alternatives or to encourage them to join a political party or something of that sort. No, they are telling them they're useless, they're not needed, they're reproducing too many children, and so on. And so they have to then be prepared for the political backlash. And so repression is an essential part of this strategy, and vast amounts of time, effort, and money have been spent on that system of repression, and it will not change because the minute it changes, then the regime's finished.
I think in your book you highlighted a very important point in the same context, and I quote, "Democracy is unlikely to take root and flourish when those who may challenge the authoritarian order must first calculate the potential personal material cost of governmental retribution." Do you think this is the moment to calculate their potential personal material cost, or we may stay or wait for another 2 or 3 or 4 years?
Osama, it's really impossible to predict that. Clearly, given the economic circumstances and clearly the profound insensitivity of President Sisi himself and the callousness with which people are treated, let's say when roads are built, virtually next to their house, and the idea that this is in Egypt that most don't have any real role in, that they have been displaced by a regime depending upon the military and the cronies of those people. So there's every reason for an average Egyptian to feel quite alienated from this regime. But at the same time, the repressive apparatus is such that they're frightened to death of it. So if that fear were to be substantially reduced, then I think you would see reactions of a pretty serious sort. And that's why you're not going to see that repression reduced. He cannot afford to do it. So that then leads up against the international community. And the international community is increasingly disenchanted with this government. It's disenchanted with its human rights abuses. It's disenchanted with its economic performance. It's disenchanted with its military dominance. And so the squeeze is coming from the outside, not from the inside. But that outside squeezing over time then begins to empower inside actors who see that the man is isolated. And so he's in a box. And the new agreement just signed with the IMF may be an indication that he realizes that and is trying to figure out a way out of this box that he built for himself. And whether he can do that or not, I don't know. I doubt. Very few political leaders can recreate the political system which, brought them to power and change course dramatically at this stage of their rule. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult.
And talking about the external pressure on the Sisi regime, Financial Times editorial board published a piece recently about Egypt, and I quote, "It is often assumed that Egypt is too important to fail and that the donors or Gulf states will always bail Cairo out." Do you agree with this analysis, Robert?
No.
Why?
No. Because, there are always tensions in inter-Arab relations. And so while the Gulf, wants stability in Egypt, on the other hand, they don't trust Egypt. And they don't trust Sisi.
Don't trust Sisi or
and
Egypt?
So, pardon me?
Don't trust Sisi? Trust the regime?
No, because they're aware of, he is trying to pursue his own personal interests, and that and what he sees as the interests of the state of Egypt, which in many cases are not the same as those in the Gulf. So with regard to the Saudis, for example, it's not just the Sisi regime, but previous ones also sought to maintain reasonable relations with Tehran, other than Sadat, who once he accepted the Shah, of course it was all over with Khomeini and the mullahs. But after that, Egypt went out of its way, both Mubarak and then Morsi, to keep lines of communication open with Tehran. Sisi has not backed the anti-Iranian position of at least the Saudis and to a lesser extent other Gulf states. So that's simply an example. Sisi has not provided significant support in Yemen, which the Saudis asked him for. The Egyptians are competing with the Saudis for influence in the Red Sea and with the Emiratis. So what they want is to keep him on a tight leash that he's dependent, and he will not be able to challenge their power and authority wherever they care to assert it. If he were to do so, then they would simply cut the purse strings, and that would be the end of the story. So they sort of got him where they want him, but if he were to try to assert independence of Egypt in some meaningful way against them, then that would be it. So I don't think that we can assume Egypt is too big to fail. In the minds of some Europeans, it might be, because they would be confronted with vast amounts of illegal migration. But the Europeans are not the central actors in this drama. They are not, in any case, united. And so the central actors are the Gulf. And the Gulf have their own ambitions and desires and so on, and that puts a limit on what Sisi can do. And you can say, instead of being too big to fail from the point of view of the Gulf, he's too small to succeed. That they are going to put a limit on what he can achieve. So I don't think it's a question of too big to fail.
Yeah, and what is the role of Western governments, Robert? Because they consider Sisi as the guardian of illegal immigration. They consider him as a guarantee of stability in the region. They keep selling him weapons, but they not offering him a money support, a direct money support as Gulf countries, and they didn't drop Egypt's external debt, for example, as they did with Mubarak in the Gulf War.
Yes, that's a good analogy. And so Egypt was paid off for not its military role in the Gulf, which was negligible and indeed negative in many regards, but it was a positive political role to have Arab support for the Kuwaitis against the Iraqis. That's what they got $30 billion for. So in this case, I would say that the willingness to write off $30 billion in debt is irrelevant, because the debt now is significantly in private hands. And debt relief, as we know, which involves not only governments in the West, but the Chinese, to some extent the Russians now in Egypt, and private banks, private investors, and so on. It's a very complex matter. And so much more complex than it was back in 1991. So I don't think that historical analogy is likely to hold in this case. Now, it is the case that these governments you refer to are desperately afraid of destabilizing consequences of a governmental collapse in Egypt. And so they are willing to provide financial and military support and political support to overcome that. But their capacities and their willingness to do so are limited. So if the situation were to deteriorate, let's say as it did in February of 2011, the ability of these governments to do something in the face of a serious challenge to the incumbent government are very limited. The Americans could do nothing, nor could the Europeans. And there is nothing to suggest that in the meantime, they've developed their abilities to have local influence of any greater magnitude than the negligible amount they had back in 2011. So the Europeans, the West in general, want stability in Egypt. It's providing certain things to try to ensure that, but that's no guarantee. And if Sisi thinks that the West can save him in the end, he's wrong.
And my final question, Robert, how do you see the future in Egypt?
I see continued decline. I don't think it can be escaped. If you were sitting in Beirut 3 years ago and you were forecasting it, I think any reasonable person, and there were plenty of them, said, no, there's no way out of this. Now, Lebanon is a small economy with a much more corrupt elite than Egypt. And so it was a more difficult task. And of course, it had gone through a civil war. But the mismanagement of the Egyptian economy is so institutionalized, and the leadership of the Egyptian economy now is in the wrong hands. There is no serious debate about policy formation, economic policy in Egypt. The leading economists have been marginalized. The people running the economy are experts in trying to garner foreign currency. That's their specialty. So the idea that you're trying to run now an economy with 104 million people, which is, one of the largest lower middle income economies in the world, with a bunch of people who really are not development economists in the slightest, and who report to a military and a president who have no idea about it, suggests that unless and until you have fundamental changes in that, you open it up, you have serious debate about what the economy of Egypt should look like, and who the actors should be and how the policy should be made. Until that occurs, you must be pessimistic, and that has yet to occur.
We will keep following the Egyptian economy situation with you, Robert. Thank you very much, Professor Robert Springborg.
Thank you, Osama, for having me.